Welcome to Cepher Commentaries. Today we pick up our commentaries with Bere'shiyth, Genesis, chapter 15. After these things, the word of Yahweh came to Avram in a vision, saying, "Fear not, Avram, I am your shield and your exceedingly great reward." And Avram said, "Adonai Yahweh, what will you give me, seeing I go childless, and the steward of my house is this Eliezer of Damascus?" And Avram said, "Behold, to me you have given no seed, and lo, one born in my house is my heir." And behold, the word of Yahweh came to him, saying, "This shall not be your heir, but he that shall come forth out of your own generation shall be your heir." And again, we see this idea of the generation of the Toldot of Avram. And the narrative of the Toldot of Avram is going to begin here with a promise from Adonai Yahweh. And we see that the top concern here of Avram is having an heir. And Adonai Yahweh's promise to Avram is that he would in fact have an heir, and that this is going to be the exceedingly great reward. And he brought him forth abroad and said, "Look now toward the heavens and count the stars, if you are able to number them." And he said to him, "So shall your seed be." And he believed in Yahweh, and he accounted it to him as righteousness. So at this point we see that Avram, this promise, which is going to become the covenant to Avram, that he would become the father of many nations and that he would inherit the Holy Land. This is the covenant of Avram. But we can see that the initiation of the promise has to do with the fact that he who was childless at this point, being beyond 75 years old, is going to be blessed with descendants so numerous that they would be as numerous as the stars in heaven. And what did Avram believe that was accounted to him as righteousness? He believed that Yahweh was going to accomplish the impossible in him. Picking up at verse 7, and he said to him, "I am Yahweh that brought you out of Ur of the Kasdim to give you this land to inherit." Now, again, we spent a little bit on this issue yesterday or the last time we talked about the commentaries, in discussing the idea of the land of Ur and the land of Haran. And we see a couple of things there. One is that the land of Ur, this word Ur, is spelled Aleph Vav Resh. And this is the same spelling as the word Or, which is translated as light. So in Genesis 1:3, you see the passage, "Vayemer Elohim, Yahior, Uyahior." And this is this idea of this possessiveness of Yah in the creation of light. And it is stated and then restated, translated as "let there be light," and there was light, but better understood as "I caused light to be," and light was caused to be. And the word there, or, Aleph Vav Resh, is the same as this word Ur, Aleph Vav Resh, and it's distinguished only by the Masoretic Nikudot, giving you a different form of the sound rather than leaving it in its unadulterated form. And we can see here that if you're looking at a true pronunciation guide, we would see it, and I'll just tell you my preferences. I am becoming more and more convinced that there was no O at all in the ancient Ivrit, that the vowel was U, and the fifth vowel was A. And A was one of the two forms of the letter Ayin, so that Ayin would be pronounced A and A. But the Aleph would be pronounced A and sometimes A, but often a. So when you see this word Aleph, Vav, Resh, Eur, 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 Eur. And this would be a more appropriate pronunciation for the word that we pronounce or for light, or even the land of Ur, Eur, Eur, Eur. And so when we see that he came to that Yahweh brought him out of the land of Ur, you could see that this is the land of light, if you will, the land of light. And then he was taken to a land called Haran. Well, Har in Ivrit is a mountain. And so this means that he was taken from the land of Ur, the land of light, which could be, it may be understood as maybe a giant flat plain, which had the sun beating down on it continually. And as a consequence, very little rain, a lot of sun, a lot of heat. And he was taken from there to Haran, a mountainous region. But nonetheless, Yah is the one that brought him out of Ur. And you might recall that Yah told Abraham, you are to leave the land of Ur and to go to a place that I have told you. And Abraham believed him there and left and obeyed, which was also accounted to him as righteousness. Verse 8, and he said, Adonai Yahweh, whereby shall I know that I shall inherit it? And he said to him, take a heifer of 3 years old, and a she-goat of 3 years old, and a ram of 3 years old, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Now, I want you to keep in mind that all of this that is happening here in chapter 15 is happening in a vision. It's happening in a vision. And he took to him all these and divided them in the midst and laid each piece one against the other, but the birds he did not divide. So the animals were slaughtered, and when they were slaughtered, they were divided in half, and the portions were facing one another in a line, but the birds were on either side. And when the fowls came down upon the carcasses, Avram drove them away. And when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Avram, and lo, a horror of great darkness fell upon him. Now, there is a text that is extra scriptural that is called the Apocalypse of Avram that talks much more about this particular event. And this particular event is one that is worthy of great study because it is a prophetic vision that is going to come upon Avram. And you might ask a question that if Yahweh came to Avram and said, I am your shield and your exceedingly great reward, why would this horror of great darkness fall upon him? Well, let's pick up the narrative in verse 13. And he said to Avram, know of a surety that your seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. Now, here again, some of the passages read that they shall be a stranger in a strange land, rather than they should be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward shall they come out with great substance. So this is really very much this is a metaphor really for a long curve that exists really in the lives of all believers, that as a young adult, you will find yourself a stranger in a land that does not belong to you, and you shall serve those who own that land, and they shall afflict you for some portion of your life. And that nation to whom you serve, Yah will judge. And afterward, you shall come forth with great substance. And so these are some things to think about. And you're going to see that this is modeled later in the life of Yaakov. Yaakov would go into a nation that was not his, leaving the land of Canaan to go forth to the home of his ancestors, that is, the home of his mother and also his mother's mother. And he would go and he would visit that family, and they would bring him in and require him to serve them. And he did for a group of 7 years, 3 times. So he was there for almost 21 years serving them. But when he left, he came out with great substance. Even though the narrative that we see in Mitzrayim is a narrative that is not quite clear, because we do not know really what was the labor of the house of Yasharel in Mitzrayim. We're told that part of it included the making of brick, but what else were they doing? Were they also cutting stone? Were they constructing edifices? Were they building canals? Were they tending sheep and herding cattle? We don't know. It's not really, well, it is kind of inferred that they were in fact doing all of those, because the sheep and the cattle would come with them. Moshe is saying, not one hoof shall we leave behind. But we can also see that in this servitude of Yaakov to Laban, that in that servitude, he would come out with great substance. And he came out with great substance based upon his own initiative. That is to say, he intelligently went to Laban and said, you know these ugly sheep that you don't like and these ugly cattle that you don't like. Yes, I know them. Well, I'm going to take those and keep them as part of my wages. And Laban agreed. Laban agreed to the contract. And when Laban agreed to the contract, Yaakov, using animal husbandry practices, was able to build substantial wealth in both cattle and sheep. Whereas Laban's herds, where he did not practice his animal husbandry, but left it to Laban's recognizance, his herds began to wither. And Laban's sons saw this and said, oh, he's stealing from our father, which was not true at all. He had just been more successful than Laban because he had paid attention to what he was doing. And so the wealth that was crafted in the hands of Yaakov was a wealth that he himself crafted using his skills based upon an agreement with his master, who in this case was Laban. Now, do we know that this was the case in Mitzrayim? We don't know that. We do know that they left with great substance. And the question is, why would the Mitzrayim give them their jewels and their wealth and their cattle and their sheep and everything else they had if they did not have a recognizance that, in fact, the house of Yasharel were the ones that had built that wealth? And I think this was the case, that the Mitzrayim knew that the wealth that had been acquired in the land, acquired from the time of Yosef, who again had used a strategy to accrue wealth in the kingdom of Mitzrayim during the 7 years of plenty, where the wheat was so plentiful it was hard to measure. And yet Yosef knew of this because of the vision given to Pharaoh and his understanding of that vision. And he built great warehouses, if you will, great barns to hold the wheat. And, you know, it's a very interesting thing, because when we talk about almost any other substance on earth in terms of meat or vegetables, you're lucky to get a year out of them. Yet with wheat, it can store from, if it's unharvested wheat, or not unharvested, but unground wheat, unseparated, the wheat is just merely cut and stored, that the wheat can last for 10, 12, 14, 15 years in a proper environment. And so as a consequence, it's one of the few food groups that can be stored that long. And Yosef began to store up wheat, and he stored up massive amounts of wheat, such that they had not only enough for Mitzrayim, but really for all the known world at that time, that they came in from all corners of the known world to get wheat after the famine waxed strong throughout the whole world for 7 years. And as a consequence of Yosef's foresight and not depriving anybody of anything during the 7 years of plenty, but storing up the surplus carefully, he was able to use that surplus to increase the kingdom of Mitzrayim to really the world's dominant kingdom, because all of the nations around them had not only given them all of their cattle, all of their sheep, and all of their wealth, but also gave them control over their lands. And so we can see that the substance in Mitzrayim at the time of the Exodus really was caused by Bere'shiyth, that is to say, Yosef, from the Ivrim, such a man, Bere'shiyth, Yosef, who ruled and controlled Mitzrayim for a 40-year period, building and establishing the foundation of all its wealth. So we can begin to see that when you talk about this idea that they shall come out with great substance, this great substance is predicated upon the idea of using your mind, thinking about what Yah has shown you, sequestering your surplus for a period of time, and using that surplus to your benefit when the time is right. And as a consequence, we see that the house of Yasharel would leave with great substance and wealth. We see that Abraham would die a very wealthy man, leaving all of his estate to Yitzchak, who would also die a very wealthy man, whose estate was stolen by Esau, and Yaakov was deprived of the estate of Yitzchak. But Yaakov, using his own intelligence and abilities, himself built a very substantial wealth during the time of his captivity, being in a land that did not belong to him, serving the master thereof, Laban, being afflicted by Laban, and then thereafterward coming out with great substance. Now, I just want to say this before we move on, that the battle between Esau and Yaakov continues to this very day. Esau continues to sequester the wealth of the world and does so at the expense of Yaakov. Yaakov continues to be blessed by Yahweh in being able to build wealth, notwithstanding the ongoing theft of the estate of Yitzchak in the hands of Esau. Okay, verse 15, and you shall go to your fathers in peace, and you shall be buried in a good old age. But in the 4th generation they shall come here again, for the iniquity of the Emorym is not yet full. And it happened when the sun went down and it was dark, behold, a smoking furnace and a burning lamp passed between those pieces. In the same day Yahweh cut a covenant with Avram, saying, to your seed I have given this land, from the river of Mitzrayim to the great river Perath, the Kenaim and the Kenitzim and the Kadmonim and the Chittim and the Perizzim and the Rephaim and the Emorym and the Canaanim and the Girgashim and the Yebusim. These are all the tribes occupying the land between the great river of Mitzrayim and the river Perath. Now, there are many people who believe that the river Perath is the river that is named in modernity the Euphrates. And I am not convinced that this is the river Perath at all, and that we have 4 rivers that are named in Genesis 2, and the Pidgeon and the Gihon, I believe, relate to these rivers. That is, the great river of Mitzrayim is the Pidgeon River, that we might understand as what is called the Nile today, and the Gihon River. And the Gihon River, I believe, is what they call the Blue Nile, and the Blue Nile divides from the Nile proper at the roughly near the city of Khartoum in Sudan, and that the Bere'shiyth is actually what's called the White Nile, which is the river that divides again from the Nile River, running all the way back down to Victoria Falls in the middle of Uganda. And so when we're talking about the great river of Mitzrayim to the river Bere'shiyth, this area is an area that appears to designate East Africa. And especially if we understand that this river Bere'shiyth is not in the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, but rather is in Africa, having its source from the same fountainhead of waters in Central Africa. And this would put most of this narrative as taking place along the western shores of what we now call the Red Sea and the Gulf of Arabia, in that area. And so that creates a kind of a different narrative when you understand it, that some of the mountains that we're talking about, the White Mountains, for instance, White Mountains is the word Lebanon, right? Laban, meaning white. And so Lebanon is the area of the White Mountains. And the White Mountains, I think, are kind of construed by mountains that are covered with snow from time to time, the White Mountains. So it depicts mountains that are quite tall. And so the question is, are these mountains also found in that area? Now, a question that came up the other day is, are there olive trees found in this area such that one mountain would be called the Mount of Olives? This is a very good question. We see that the area down there is replete with cattle, and it is replete with bees, so it is a land of milk and honey. It's also replete with copper and gold and iron, and it's a land well watered, broad and wide. And this is the land that is promised to Abraham, this land of Canaan. And in this area, there are many, many tribes. So we can see there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 tribes that are living in this land that Abraham is going to be given. And so this is going to be something quite interesting for Abraham. All right. And so I'm going to wrap up our discussion here on Genesis chapter 15.